I joined the Labor Party 34, 35 years ago, when all you had to be was a worker. I used to have a menswear store. I still do, as a matter of fact, and I will take orders later on, on the North Shore of Sydney. And I came into Parliament conscious of the fact that I had not had a tertiary education, and that more and more of my colleagues were coming in with BAs and LLBs and PhDs and what have you, and I just had a leaving certificate. And I had a brother, Dr. Paul Cohen, who's a senior lecturer in anthropology at Macquarie University. I felt inadequate, if I wanted to get on, and I always wanted to do this. So when we were elected to government in 1972, and I ran for the ministry and narrowly missed out by 48 votes, I decided that I would fill this gap in my CV, and so I got a mature age matriculation from the ANU, see I'm a local graduate, and I started university, but I needed leave from the whip, for the whip to go to lectures. So I went and saw him. He said, well, you better go and talk to the Prime Minister. So I did, and I said, and Gough is a terrible snob about matters academic. I mean, he knows everybody's degree and what they've got, and if you haven't really got one, you don't count. And he said to me, comrade, this is very good of you, but why are you doing it? I said, well, you're the major cause. He said, explain yourself. I said, well, you remember back in 1969 when you were very proud of the fact that a new breed of Labor politician had emerged. Gone were the days of the soup-stained tie and the dirty fingernails and the cloth cap. The young Whitlamites had emerged and with academic qualifications. And when you launched the 69 campaign, you stood up in front of 2,000 people and you said, men and women of Australia, never before in the history of the Labor movement have so many men of academic qualifications cast aside their private role to serve the nation. We've got Dr. Bob Wan, 2IC of the Bureau of Agriculture. We've got Major Peter Young, 2IC of the Vietnam Intelligence Unit. We've got Mr. Bill Morrison, a senior diplomat. We've got Dr. Klugman, a medico. We've got Barry Cohen from the North Shore. I said, then you made it worse. I said, a couple of weeks later, you met me at the airport, you put your arm around me, you said, comrade, I met your brother Paul the other day. He's the cerebral one in the family. Well, anyhow, as I said, I had a menswear store, and when we were in opposition, it was difficult to get to talk to the leader of the opposition. But when when you were in government, it was impossible as a backbencher to see the Prime Minister, almost. And I was sitting on the back bench. I mean, I was that far on the back bench. If I'd been any further, I'd been sitting out in the toilets, feeling unloved and unwanted, when suddenly the great man loomed up in front of me. Comrade, he said, I need your advice. And I thought, at last I've been called. What is it the great man wants of me? What advice on those issues for which I was nationally famous? The Middle East, road safety, sport, tourism. Yes, Prime Minister. What can I do? He said, I need some shirts. But we Cohens of this world, ours is not to question why. It's our duty to cater for the sartorial delights of the rich and famous. So, a call to serve. I looked at him and I thought, this is not going to be easy, because, you know, he's 6'5". He had arms like an orangutan. He's the only person I know who could scratch his knees without bending over. And how am I going to be able to fit him? So anyhow, I got Anthony Squire of Coronet Shirts to send a bloke down, and we went round with all the materials and we laid them out on the thing, and he picked out a dozen materials to be made, and they're measuring his sleeves. And you wouldn't believe, I mean, if you know anything about clothing, 33 inches is a standard length sleeve. 34 is long, 35 is extra long. He was 38 inches long. Right? And while we were measuring him, the guy said, he said, I like to show a bit of cuff. A typical Labor man. And he said, he said to me, do you think I should have single or double cuffs? I said, Prime Minister, it's a matter of personal taste. I said, I prefer single cuffs. Good, he said, I'll have double cuffs. So, anyhow, but don't forget a bit of cuff. So, away they went, and 3 weeks later, down they came. I took them round to a dozen shirts, down to the Prime Minister's office. Thank you, comrade. And about an hour later, I'm in the parliamentary dining room having dinner, and this apparition walks past like this. I said, what's wrong? He said, they're too short. He said, they're too short. So I get onto the factory and I talk to the factory. He rings me back. He says, the cutter wouldn't believe anyone had arms that long. I said, well, he better bloody believe it because he's going to have to make them all again. So back they went, 3 weeks passed, back came the shirts. I took them round. Thank you, comrade. I was walking through the lobbies here and a voice booms out, can't you bloody Jews get anything right? I said, what's wrong with them now? He said, they're single cuffs. I said, you're lucky, mate. I said, the factory manager's wife wanted them an inch an hour around the neck. While he was Prime Minister, the first... No, I don't think any Prime Minister had ever been to Coffs Harbour. But Gough, for whatever reason, decided to go. And he took with him Kerry Cybra, who was at the time Assistant Secretary of the party but later became President of the Senate, and Doug McClellan, who was a Minister for the Media and also became President of the Senate later on. But they flew into Coffs Harbour and they were greeted by a very nervous president of the local branch of the ALP, shaking like a leaf. And they went off down to the local RSL club for the usual gathering of the faithful. There was much laying on of hands and what have you. And the president gets up, shaking like a leaf, to introduce Gough. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, distinctive guests, he said, I want to introduce the President of Australia, Mr Gough Whitlam, Senator Jim McClellan and Mr Terry Cybra. Gough turned to Doug McClellan and he said, comrade, we're amongst savages. I think it was in 1971 he decided that the issue that occupied the minds of most people in Australia was independence for New Guinea. And of course he was right. I mean, I'd be having a drink at the Woy Woy pub and workers would rush up and say, mate, when are we going to give them independence for New Guinea? But that was what differentiated Gough from the rest of us mere mortals. But anyhow, off they went, and there was... I think Mick Young went with him, and Kim Beazley won, and Hayden and a few others. And anyhow, everywhere he went, he got a rapturous applause. Thousands turned out, and it was a sensational trip. But they were in, I think it was Mount Hagen, and 10,000 locals turned out to greet Gough. And at the end of a rapturous reception, they presented him with a long carved wooden staff with a snake entwined around it with a long red head at the top of it. And Gough can't help himself. As he stepped off the podium, he turned to Mick Young and he said, comrade, what'll I do, lean on it or strap it on? He had an interesting relationship with the Fourth Estate, as you well know, Jack. One journalist, for whatever reason, he didn't get on with was a fellow, John Monks. But anyhow, he didn't like him. John was interviewing one day, and he said, Gough said to him, Monks, are you by any chance related to a journalist called Lou Monks who wrote before the war? Yes, said John, he was my father. Oh, said Gough. He said, I assume he influenced you in your choice of career. And John said, no, as a matter of fact, he said, no son of mine is ever going to be a journalist. And Gough said, and he was right. Gough never got on with the little people of Caucus. And you'll recall that we had a lot of little people. You look through John Button and Al Brasby and Richie Gunn, and you go back through. In fact, often the caucus room looked like the saddling paddock at Flemington. But something he seemed to clash. I think I call it his Gulliver complex. He didn't get on with little people, but he and Richie Gunn clashed like you wouldn't believe. And there were some famous clashes in caucus between the two of them. Anyhow, 75 came round and Gough was campaigning for Ritchie in Kingston, and he's elected in Adelaide, and sitting up at about 300 people there on a table, and Gough's flicking through Ritchie's pamphlet. And he suddenly comes on a spot that says, "The Prime Minister has often commented on Dr. Gunn's wide general knowledge." Gough turned to Ritchie and he said, "What's this?" I said, "No such thing." "Yes, you did, Prime Minister." "I did not." "Yes, you did." He said, "You often call me an effing little know-all." In 1978, when he retired, we decided at Gosford to give him the first of the Farewell to Gough evenings, and I sent out invitations. Within a matter of days, we sold out 700 tickets, packed out. I had to go on the local radio station and announce that it was sold out. Anyhow, the great night arrived, and Gough and Dame Margaret turned up at the Leagues Club. They were ushered up the front steps into had the compulsory glass of sherry with the local council and mayor. And he wandered over to me and he said, "Well, comrade, how's it going?" And I said, "Wonderful." I said, "It's extraordinary. Sold out. 700 tickets. Had to go on air, advertise, tell them they were full." He said, I said, "Look, it's amazing, isn't it?" I said, "When you were Prime Minister, they all hated you." I said, "When you were Leader of the Opposition again," I said, "they still loathe you." I said, "Now you're about to retire, they all love you." He said, "They never stopped loving me." He said, "It was you bastards they hated." I remember the opening of the Sydney Entertainment Centre, and I was standing talking to Graham Freudenberg, and who was, of course, the speechwriter supremo, who wrote for Arthur Calwell, for Gough, of course, for Neville Wran, and he was writing for Bob Hawke. Anyhow, he was doing both Hawke and Rand at the one time. Gough sort of came over to join us and he said, "Comrade," he said to Graham, "what's it like in the biblical sense, serving two masters?" And Graham said, "Well, in fact, they talk very much alike." Well, he said, it's not that difficult." He said, "Neville tends to stick to the speech much as I've written it," he said, "and Gough and Bob, but Bob," he said, "tends to often go off on a tangent." He said, "I think he thinks he can speak better than I can write." Gough looked at him and said, "Yes," he said, "I know what you mean, comrade." He said, "The man's got an insufferable ego." Greg Lunn told me a story he was a junior diplomat when Mick Shan was in Japan. And in 1970, I think 76, 78, Gough and Margaret came through, and they wanted to see the Japanese city of Kamakura, historic city. So Greg had the job of escorting them down to Kamakura and back. They went down on a bullet train and had a great day. And before that, he really boned up on Japanese history and on Kamakura in particular, because he knew he was with the great historian and wanted to be very meticulous and that he got everything right and got the broad sweep of Japanese history. And on the way back, everything had gone well. And Greg said, "Well, how was it?" And Gough said, "Comrade, it was wonderful day. Excellent," he said. "I thought you handled yourself remarkably well." But he said, "I must say," he said, "that I always thought that Kamakura was destroyed in 1333, not 1334, as you alleged." In 1984, he was celebrating his 68th birthday in Paris. He was ambassador to UNESCO, and at the time, Mark Latham, who has become quite well known in recent times, was his research assistant. And he'd celebrate his 68th birthday on the 11th of July. And they were staying at the Palais Seidler, as Gough calls it, looking out over on Bastille night on the 14th, looking out at the wonderful fireworks display. And Gough turned to Mark and he said, "Comrade," he said, "this is very good of the French, even if they are 3 days late." But that a little pause from Gough for a while. But the Senate. We're in this building, as I said, I spent relatively little time, obviously, in. And I was reminded of the Senate and the great characters that served in here, and one, Gareth Evans, who, when he was first elected to the Senate, his legal colleagues gave him a send-off party in Melbourne and presented him with 2 bags, one for his clothes and the other for his ego. Senator John Faulkner, now in the other place, but I think he served briefly. No, he may not have served here, but he was a senator. He was telling me a wonderful story during the campaign in the New South Wales election in it was about 1978 or 81, and a lot of people were flying the flag in seats for Labor that really were unwinnable. One in particular, Dr. Therese McGee, was Labor's endorsed candidate in the seat of Northcote on Sydney's leafy North Shore, Beecroft, Epping and places like that. And John, who was Assistant Secretary of the party, was commissioned to get some dignitaries to go with her, ministers. They tried the Premier, of course. He was going to waste his time in a seat where he needed about a 23% swing to win it. And so they tried the ministers. No, they didn't want to go. And members of Parliament, they didn't want to go. So finally he thought, I'll go to support the poor lass and we'll get a few of the local branch members. And off they went. Got the old battered ute. And there was with them a professor in the traditional garb of the socially committed, the duffel coat and the thongs and the corduroy trousers and the beard and the whole kit and caboodle. No offence to any academics here. And they pitched tent outside the Beecroft shopping centre. And John and Therese got up and they started talking about education and health and transport and the usual important issues. And the professor was getting more and more agitated. He finally couldn't take it longer and he said, give me the mic. He said, I'll show these bastards. He said, let's give them some real socialism. Grabs the mic and he said, peasants and workers of Beecroft unite. Let's hear it for Labor's Therese McGee. Well, that went down like a lead balloon. So they pulled the plug on that one and off they went round the corner, a couple of miles, and they came to the Beecroft Lawn Tennis Association. Well, if you thought the other thing was a bit upmarket, you should have seen this place. There they were, genteel North Shore, you got no idea. Batting balls gently across the net. Same thing happened. I mean, there was hardly anyone for miles around. He finally grabs the mic in frustration and says to them, tennis players of Beecroft, he said, lay down your balls for Labor. Suffice to say, we didn't win the seat of Northcote. I'm reminded, as Jim will remember, of course, a very dear character, Senator Bert Hendrickson. No longer with us, he's gone to the big Senate in the sky, but a big bluff fellow was Bert from Victoria. And he and Doug McClellan and a few others, Doug told me the story, were up campaigning in the northern sugar seats of New South Wales, again, particularly in those days, not exactly socialist country, but they were flying the flag. And they had a meeting. There was quite a crowd of farmers there. And when it came to question time, one young, enthusiastic young man jumped up, clutching his Senate Hansard, and he said, I have a question for you, Senator Hendrickson. Yes, said Bert. He said, I'd like to know why the Labor Party voted against the Sugar Bounty Bill. And Bert said, we did not. He said, you did? No, we did not. He said, Senator, he said, I have the Senate Hansards here with me, and it shows that the Labor Party voted against the Sugar Bounty Bill. He said, young man, he said, I can see from your age that you are a young man. He said, what you don't understand is Senate voting procedures. By voting against the bill, we were voting for it. He said, I don't understand it. He said, I know you don't understand it. He said, I'm not going to take up the time of all these good people and explain. But he said, if you'll come back afterwards, I'll go through it with you in detail. Well, he couldn't be fairer than that. The crowd thought it was extraordinary generosity on his part. And so anyhow, the meeting ended. back they went backstage, they're standing around having a drink, and suddenly this young man appears on stage. He said, "Senator Hendrickson." And Bert turns around and says, "Piss off." It's a little unparliamentary, but the President hasn't called me to order. As I mentioned, I was the Environment Minister, and if I may say a little boast, my proudest achievement is that in the 4.5 years I was there, when I took over the Barrier Reef, about 14.5% of the region was in the park. When I left, 98.5, which is now what it is in the park. All it was contained. But we used to have a lot of meetings with the Premier of Queensland. We had a ministerial council. Barry Jones and I were on it, and Sir Joe and Peter McKechnie were the Queensland minister. So we met twice a year, once in Canberra, once on the Barrier Reef. I had to go to the Barrier 3 or 4 times a year. It was rough, but somebody had to do it. And you might recall, periodically we'd have these outbreaks of the crown of thorns starfish. And they would suddenly discover that a third of the reef had been eaten, and I'd get a phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning from the ABC asking me what I was going to do about it. So I was going to go up there and personally spear them all myself. But I got Cabinet to approve a $4 million program to do research, because we really didn't know what was causing it. I mean, the research on the reef is relatively recent. Anyhow, we wanted the Queenslanders to kick in some proportion of the money. We kicked $4 million. We wanted them to kick in $1 million over 4 years. So we had this meeting at the Great Barrier Reef Wonderland. It was a big table that ran right down here like this, and there's myself and Barry sitting here, and Peter and Joe there, and all these public servants on either side, and there's Graham Kelleher, the chairman of the Great Barrier Reef. And I've asked the question, will the Queenslanders kick in $250,000 a year? And Joe wasn't keen to give us anything. I mean, you know what he was like. And he said, "Well, look here, this horn of crown starfish thing, now we've had this thing here on now for 15, 18, 13 years or more. And that professor, that Indian fellow, he took me out there, when those horn of crown starfish came down, and we went out and had a good look at the whole thing there, and there was nothing wrong, all that Barrier Reef stuff thing, it was all lovely and gleaming white." Nothing at all. There you never heard a silence like it. There were Queenslanders shuffling their papers and hiding it. And suddenly Graham Kelleher got up and he said, "Mr Premier, the reason why they're all lovely and gleaming white is that they're all dead." Which had occurred to most people. But in my role as Arts Minister, I was very proud of what we achieved in the film industry, but it was terribly important, I thought, to ensure that the public servants and the ministers knew that we were doing great things in the film industry. So some of you may recall I used to hold film evenings of the latest and greatest Australian movies. And when we had Farlap on, I'd get some of the film stars to come down, and the producers and producers and actors, what have you, to make speeches and mingle with the guests. And John Sexton told us the story of the making of Farlap. The night before they were filming the race, the 1930 Melbourne Cup that Farlap won, he woke up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and in a cold sweat he suddenly realised that the horses had to finish in exactly the same order as they did in 1930. So he couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Got down there early, 6 o'clock, called all the jockeys in, and he said, "Gentlemen, we have a very serious problem." Yes? He said, "The horses must finish in exactly the same order as they did in 1930. There was a long pause, and the leading jockey said, "What's the problem?" To wind up, I've gone over my time. I think my favourite Gough story is one you may have heard before, but it always bears telling again. It was 1975. The Brisbane Rugby League final was on. We were at the height of our popularity, as you'll recall. And Gough was invited by Senator Ron McAuliffe, President of the Queensland Rugby League, to launch the Brisbane Rugby League Grand Final. And Gough, whose interest in sport is about the same as Paul Keating's is in Australian rules, agreed to go. And he arrived there, and there was 20,000 people. And as he and Ron walked out to the middle of Lang Park, they went berserk. They hissed, they booed, they jeered, they threw meat pies, beer cans, anything they had their hands on. It was awful. But after 10 minutes, they'd exhausted their viciousness and their spleen, sufficient for Gough to cook the ball. And he walked off the ground with Ron, and he turned to him and he said, "McAuliffe, don't you ever invite me to a place where you're so unpopular."